Okay, folks, here is the lecture on crowdfunding, as promised. This is a little different from our normal lectures in that I actually haven't given this lecture before in front of a class, so it might be a little bit more disorganized and probably a little bit quicker than usual. But the intention is to give an overview of what crowdfunding is and also to discuss its rationale and what we know about it thus far. Obviously, crowdfunding has in many respects been a thing only for a short period of time, so there's not a lot we know, except it does seem like in some of its forms it is here to stay. So what is the rationale for crowdfunding? Crowdfunding is where you want to fund something and you look at an entire crowd to contribute towards it. Obviously, there have been lots of examples of that for many hundreds of years, in fact. And in fact, there are sort of three rationales that have come up. The original rationale for any sort of crowdfunding was basically patronage, charity. You wanted to see something happen, so you would contribute money to see it happen. Those were the sorts of things. You didn't expect anything more than seeing the public good happen or what have you. More recently, crowdfunding has started to look more like pre-orders. That is, what you try to do is you you're trying to launch a business of some kind or launch a particularly creative work or a new product design, and it's going to cost you some capital up front. And so what you do is you say, well, I could just bring that to market and take the risk myself. Or alternatively, wouldn't it be great to lock in a whole lot of pre-orders so that I knew things would be just fine before I expend all that capital? Now, there are some issues associated with that. Namely, when you don't have a product, will people want to commit their money to it, even though there is always some chance you might not deliver it? So that's been part of the issue. And of course, we've seen Kickstarter and Indiegogo, or Indiegogo was first, but can Kickstarter come in and solve that to some degree, but solve it by providing a platform, not actually solving it contractually. The final thing that crowdfunding has talked about is opening up equity markets. That is, what if you wanted to actually fund a business, give some capital and earn some equity back for it? I'm not going to have as much to say about that, partly because it's not really a thing, and not quite yet. It is a thing amongst the rich. If you earn over $250,000 a year and have some other criteria, you are allowed to contribute money and get some equity in whatever you want. If you're below that, you can't. That's what it's like in Canada and pretty much in the US as well. And it's probably a good idea because most of these investments are kind of stupid, in any risk-adjusted way. So what I think is that, so we won't talk much about equity funding, but I will provide you some links in case you want to read about stuff that is there. So all this comes back to digitization, and so the reason we think about crowdfunding in the digital context is that we're thinking about the particular problems people face in producing informational goods, namely that they have very large fixed costs up front and low marginal costs thereafter, which means that you would it's sort of there's a challenge, as we saw in our lectures on price discrimination, of being able to capture enough value to make sure you always cover your fixed costs. So informational goods have these common creation costs, and often we think of ways of saying, well, how do we share those costs, okay, to allow more stuff to be created? Sometimes we actually bundle diverse preferences together. You share a bit more of my cost than was worth to you, I share a bit more of you, but somehow we all end up with more. We somehow have lending arrangements. Kindle had this lending arrangements where you can sort of buy some digital goods and then lend it to other people. Those things haven't really taken off. And then we're going to have Kickstarter. That's a group commitment. We'll talk more about that. We've also had real sale markets if the goods can be physically embodied, that it can allow sharing of costs across more people. So basically, if your distribution costs are positive, then so long as there are some traction costs are not too high, then a content seller actually prefers it if these consumers perform sharing clubs. So the idea is, so the thought was that, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to sell these informational goods to the first person, but we're going to be very, very permissive on how many people get to contribute. And the notion is that if I knew as a buyer that I can share the goods and spread the benefits and even earn some money from that, I'm going to be more likely to pay a higher price initially. And in fact, if distribution costs are positive and transaction costs are not too high, then you can actually show that a content seller actually prefers it if the consumers freely share their stuff and can sell it that way. And the logic is the consumers themselves may be better distributors amongst themselves than a content provider might be. So social sharing rather than search. And in this case, the provider benefits from making sharing easy and permissible. And this is some of the stuff that we saw actually. I had a student here at Rotman who looked at what happened when we got rid of digital rights management on music. It turned out it happened, labels happened one after the other, so you could identify the effect of it. And what was shown was that it actually increased the demand and revenue from artists in the longer tail. For very famous artists, it didn't have any impact, which is also interesting, by the way. But for ones in the longest tail, it had great impact. And the idea was that these people were sharing goods amongst themselves, and they'd say, oh, wow, I've discovered a new artist here I didn't know about, and then you'd buy the rest of their collection. That was probably the mechanism going on. So that's something that can occur to spread the fixed costs around. Okay, and so there's some examples of that that I think I've already provided some readings on. Okay, but let's step back. So an alternative to crowdfunding is being a bit more liberal in how you engage consumers and allow them to share goods and come up with their own arrangements. I guess this group, the Wu-Tang group, is kind of going to the extreme. They're just producing their album's been produced, and they're just going to have one copy of it and have it on display, and one person will be allowed to buy it. I'm hoping that that's just a commentary on the information age, but it also is maybe an extreme version of this, like we'll just sell one and then you can work out how to commercialize it thereafter. The problem is, of course, it only kicks the commercialization decision down to the consumers who might buy it, but who knows, that might be the right person. Okay. Let me give you an example of an early example of something that looked a lot like crowdfunding. And that came from the mind of Stephen King. Stephen King's the horror writer, very famous writer. And in 2000, he had this idea. He saw the future. He said it's all going to be digital. We haven't quite got there yet, even 15 years later. But, he saw that it was going to be digital. And he took a novel of his called The Plant that hadn't been released. And he released the book on his website, www.stephenking.com. And the way he did it was this. He said he was going to release it in installments. And the cost of each installment was going to be $1 each for the first 3 episodes, like chapters. There'd be sort of words. And then the installments 4 through 7 or 8 would be longer, up to as much as 25,000 words. And the download price would go up to $2.50. But it wasn't as simple as that. The deal was this. So long as 75% of the people who download an installment actually pay up, either on his site or at Amazon.com, he was going to publish the next installment. So that was his deal. He gives one installment out, and if 75% of the people who download it, and he can measure how many downloads there were, and how many payments there were, he would publish the next one. If you got less than 75%, that's it. No more. So no one gets to hear the what happens in this book. Okay? It was an interesting experiment. And he put it this way. My friends, we have a chance to become big publishing's worst nightmare. Not only are we going glueless, look Ma, no ebook, no tiresome encryption, want to print it and show it to a friend, go ahead. There's only one catch. All this is on the honor system. It has to be. I'm counting on two things. First is plain old honesty. Take what you want and pay for it, as the old saying goes. The second is that you'll like the story enough to want to read more. If you do want more, you have to pay. Remember, pay and the story rolls, steal and the story folds. No stealing from the blind newsboy. Okay, so that was the idea. Okay. He was basically trying to cut publishers, the whole works. He thought he could, that would be really interesting if you could do that. Would it work? How would you change things to make it work? Well, let me tell you what happened. What happened with the plant? It was released. 200,000 were downloaded in the first installment. That's a lot. 75% did pay $1 for the first, 70% for the second, 75% for the third installments. King then, as he promised, doubled the cost of the fourth installment to $2 and doubled the page length, but only 54% paid. That was it. The book was never completed. It's never been completed. It's never been fully released, which is quite interesting. So the mechanism failed to sell the book. Now, there could be a few reasons for that. One is, of course, is that people didn't like the book enough, that they didn't want the other installments. So this may be a dramatic success. But we don't 100% know that. And part of the reasons we don't know that is that Stephen King's mechanism had some good properties in it. It was sort of like saying, if enough people agree, we'll go to the next one. And that would allow, and it had a bit of inducement to get there. But it had a bad property in that you didn't know how many people had paid. So here I am thinking, should I pay? Should I not pay? Well, if I pay and it turns out only 50% have paid, well, I've just wasted my money. So I don't know if I want to do that. You've got a big form of the prisoner's dilemma going on here. And so it's a bit of a risk. And worse than that, even if I believe 80% have paid, well, then I shouldn't pay too. So that's not a very good mechanism. One thing you could do to change that is you could provide information. Right, information that describes how this is going to work. How many people have contributed and how many have paid, and then you'll have an idea. So because if you were the one person who's thinking, am I going to pay, am I not, and you can push it over the 75% threshold, then that could probably work out better. Now, there's still some free riding issues associated with that, but it might be a little bit of better way to go. The other thing you could do, of course, is you could make it less risky. You could make it less risky in the sense that, instead of when you pledge an amount and you pay, that's it, you've paid, regardless of whether you get the next installment or not. King could have said, you pay, you pledge an amount, but if you don't meet it, if the collective 75% isn't met, you get a refund. So that would have made it much easier for people to do that and not make this thing. Now, it's not a perfect mechanism, even with those two changes, information and also some refundability, but might have been the way to go. But as it is, the plant was no more, and so we didn't see it come back again, at least not from Stephen King. We did see some examples of voluntary payment. Panera Bread in St. Louis allowed people to order lunch and pay whatever they wanted, which was an interesting experiment that went on for a little while. Radiohead released an album on the honor system, and basically, not everybody paid, but they earned quite a few. They sold actually about 3 million, which is not too bad. I don't know if it's more or less than they would have sold with this particular album otherwise. We could never really know for sure, but nonetheless, it was something significant. And of course now, and we'll discuss this later, we see Kickstarter with its own thing. So I will come back to that in the next installment of the lecture. Oh, I also want to mention Louis C.K. Recently had a download system where you could share and do all things, but he basically said, if I earn enough from this, I'll keep on doing it this way. And if you find it more convenient, pay up for it. And for Louis C.K. that seemed to work. He didn't have the silly 75% rule. He just basically said, you know, if it's worthwhile, I'll keep doing it, and it's been tremendously successful for him. Okay, we'll stop that for the moment and come back in the next installment.